Welcome to the annual Darwin Day Lecture. As you probably are aware, Darwin Day is an international celebration of science and humanity which was started in 1994 and is now a worldwide phenomenon. This is the BHA's 6th annual Darwin Day Lecture in association with SPES, and is part of a complete programme, normally every year, but particularly this year, a series of lectures in which the BHA seeks to promote rational debate on key issues, which is what science and humanism are all about. Of course, science is even more central to human survival on this planet now, and so we must better develop the appreciation of science, which is, of course, where our chair for the lecture this evening comes in. Richard Dawkins, Professor Richard Dawkins, is the Charles Simonyi Professor for Public Understanding of Science at Oxford University. He's been a very successful science writer over the past 30 years, presenting scientific ideas in an accessible and readable way. And Richard is a Vice President of the British Humanists Association. When I introduced Richard a few years ago at this lecture, you may remember that I had Googled him, and Richard Dawkins came out with 2.1 million items. I also Googled Charles Darwin. He came out with 3.9 million items, from which I concluded then that Richard Dawkins was just over half as famous as Charles Darwin. What is the Google situation in 2009? Well, Dawkins has increased to 2.9 million, but Darwin has pulled ahead at 12.1 million. So Darwin is pulling away from Dawkins, which is, I think, exactly what Richard would want anyway. However, the search that I didn't do 3 years ago was God, God. God is on 550 million items, so there's still some catching up to do. The good news is that the top item on the God Google search is a reasoned and balanced Wikipedia article. Wikipedia tends to do well in these things. Number 6 is a furniture shop in Hong Kong called Goods of Desire, G-O-D, right? So their logo is the acronym G-O-D. Well, they got their web search optimization right, didn't they? If you need new furniture, you Google God. Richard features at number 32 for the book The God Delusion. But worryingly, above Richard's entry are a couple of entries which claim to provide scientific evidence for God's existence. Evidence is, of course, what advertisers have to provide for their claims. So nowadays, the authority on God is the Advertising Standards Authority. As you know, the Wonderful Atheist Bus campaign took off a few months ago in response to advertising for religious courses, and the campaign has raised nearly, I understand, £180,000, more than 30 times its original target. Richard Dawkins was a keen initial supporter of the Atheist Bus campaign, and of course, this being the year that it is, he's busier now than ever, and particularly tomorrow with the Darwin Bicentenary. But this evening he is here with us. Please welcome Richard Dawkins.
Sir David King is one of Britain's most distinguished scientists. He was, for 7 years, the public face of British science as government chief scientist from 2000 to 2007. It was his misfortune, I suppose, to be a leader of world scientific policy, including with respect to climate change and global warming, during a time when the world's most powerful nation was presided over by the most scientifically unenlightened president in living memory, or from before that. So David fought the good fight on these and many other issues. He stands, as I learned from talking to him before we came in, he stands no nonsense from bureaucrats, and I wish him luck in Oxford, where he's now moved. He was born in South Africa in 1939. He was Professor of Chemistry at Liverpool and then Cambridge, as well as Master of Downing College. As I said, he's now moved to Oxford. I'm delighted to say that he's come to Oxford as Director of the Smith School of Enterprise and the environment. I have a particular reason for looking forward to his talk this evening on British science, because I've just signed an agreement with Channel 4 to present a five-part, or some of a five-part documentary on the genius of British science, the idea of which is to look historically at Britain's contribution to science, with a view to encouraging young people who might be contemplating going to university to read media studies or some such thing, to encourage them by looking at our British heritage to go into something worthwhile like science. So it's a very great pleasure to introduce Sir David King to talk on Can British Science Rise to the New Challenges of the 21st Century?
Richard, thank you very much. I'm absolutely delighted and, of course, honoured to be here to celebrate the 200th birthday of this wonderful man, Darwin. We have come a very long way since then, and I'm just going to start by bringing up a quotation from, and in this place quite often I suspect one doesn't read quotations from reverence, but this is an apology 200 years after his death. We misunderstood you and we tried to practice the old virtues of faith, seeking understanding and hope that will make some amends. We do understand, they're saying, that because we originally opposed your views, there are still people opposing those views. Darwin was part of a wonderful scientific revolution, and when I say a part, of course, an enormous part. His theory of natural selection is still being developed as we speak now into more and more sophisticated forms. Molecular biology has taken it on to a different domain. But I want to reflect very quickly on that massive turnaround in British science and European science that was occurring before Darwin and around that period, when people like Michael Faraday, I am a chemical physicist, so forgive me if I mention someone from the non-life science side. These people transformed our ability to understand the universe around us, but also moved on to developing through that understanding a massive improvement in the well-being of humanity. So through the scientific understanding and the technology derived on it, and all of those advances, we have created a totally different kind of society for ourselves. And I'm going to suggest that we can measure that improvement in terms of the improved life expectancy around the world. Yes, we've got to give tribute to the improvements in the structures by which we structure our society. But really, the improvements deriving from science, engineering, technology, agriculture, medicine, civil engineering, I'm going to pick out as a massive transforming capability in providing us with clean water conditions. Through those improvements, lifespan has increased from 40 to 45 at the beginning of the 20th century around the world to, in this country, we're now 80 and increasing year on year. There's no, by the way, a challenge for Richard and others, there's no sign of that plateauing out. As a function of time, lifespan is still increasing linearly in all of our advanced countries. So measure success by life expectancy and we have massive successes. And there's a downside to this because we started the 20th century with 1.5 billion people. But through these successes, and I would suggest through the translation of these successes around the world, we have seen a massive increase in population. And so a follow-through from the improvements in our well-being has to be, through population dynamics, this has to be an increase in the population. And so country by country, what we see is measure female fecundity, the average number of children per woman, is the same transition. Back in the Middle Ages in Britain, 7 or 8 children per woman, of which 2 survived into maturity on average. 2.1 is the figure for a stable population, and so, give or take, Black Death or whatever, population was essentially stable. And then we come to this sudden improvement in well-being. And the population takes off because all 7 or 8 survive into maturity. Women are caught out. And so, and it takes women, it seems, about 2 generations to understand what's happened. And now we have in this country female fecundity at 1.85. And if you count in immigration, we're back to roughly a stable population. And that happens country by country. As you get caught out by sudden improvement, there's a sudden population explosion, not just because people are living longer, but because more people are surviving into maturity, and as people survive into maturity, if you'll excuse a Dawkins type expression, they tend to form breeding couples, and breeding couples breed. And so we get a population explosion. It's living longer, but also more people to have children. So the population dynamics demands that we go through a sudden population growth period, and then we come back into equilibrium. Country by country, we mustn't misunderstand this by saying this is a problem of Africa, where population growth is occurring. This also occurred here. It occurred in every single country. But the upshot of this is that as we face the 21st century, and this is the subject of this lecture, we have a different series of challenges from those that faced Darwin and Faraday back in the 19th century. The challenges today are not about improving well-being alone, that challenge remains, but the challenges are from the fact of the size of our global population and the limited resources of this single planet of ours. So as we move into the 21st century, we have to re-gear our thinking around this new massive challenge. And that thinking needs to factor in governance and governments. And I'm going to say that today it is possible to govern without science, but it's impossible to govern well without science. And I'm going to try and illustrate that point. By the way, I'm not going to suggest that science is the only requirement. The most science-savvy government of the day today is China, in my view. Look at the Politburo. You have the most remarkable group of geophysicists, engineers, scientists. They're dominating the Politburo. They understand science. But more is required, democracy as well. Let me give you an example. December 26, 2004, we were all enjoying the post-Christmas suppers or whatever we'd had, and there was this awful event happening off the coast of Indonesia. So what transpired was a massive tsunami deriving from these great plates carrying continents in collision with each other, and the plates in collision with each other, and of course Darwin would have loved this, the collision is occurring at the rate at which your fingernails grow. It's not rapid, but it's got massive momentum from the weight of the continents carried by the plates. And that collision sometimes gets stuck, and along the Sumatran Trench there was a 1,000-kilometre stretch that had got stuck for about 150 years. And the point is that the scientists now understand the origin of these amazing events. And the outcome was 230,000 fatalities. Now, the people of Banda Aceh, this is the piece of the coastline which we're looking at here, left before and right immediately after the event. The people of Banda Aceh, of course, had no chance whatsoever. The people in the towns in here were simply swept away within minutes of the tsunami beginning. But what about the people in the rest of Indonesia, the people in Sri Lanka, the people in India, and even the people in Kenya? A long way away. We were watching this tsunami on our television sets. They had no idea that it was heading for them. There was no early warning system in the Indian Ocean. Being responsible to my Prime Minister, I knew that I had to prepare a report, so I quickly got some British experts on seismology around me, and by the time the Prime Minister was back in the office on 2nd of January, there was a report saying the scientists knew this was going to happen. They couldn't predict it would happen on December 26th of that year, but they knew it was going to happen, and they had attempted to persuade the local governments to put an early warning system in. It was estimated the cost would have been about $30 million, and with an early warning system in place, my own estimate is 150,000 lives plus would have been saved. It's not just an early warning system plus the usual fire alarm practices. We're now getting an early warning system in place in the Indian Ocean, again after the cataclysmic event, as if the state of science was such that we didn't understand events of this kind. Now, you can go back to the Pacific Ocean and say, well, Pacific Ocean had an early warning system, and in fact, when I went into the United Nations immediately after this event, I was told by the people who should know that it was a random event, that it wasn't expected to occur in the Indian Ocean because tsunamis happen in the Pacific Ocean. Now, of course, the early warning system went into the Pacific Ocean after that enormous 1960s tsunami that occurred off the Canadian coast, so again after the event. Predictions have been made that this particular trench would go back in 1979, and the community had said, and it's more and more imminent, and no attention was paid to that. Now that is just one example of how governments, if they had listened at the time to what the best science has to say, might have managed risk to their own populations rather better. Let me take you back to life expectancy. And I made a rather broad statement at the beginning that we have massively improved life expectancy around the world, and we have. And so if you take India, for example, life expectancy is now 65 in India. If you go down to South America, let me express it in another way. South America 30 years ago, average female fecundity was about 6. It's now 2.2 for the whole of South America. So what we see is well-being improved, massive change in life expectancy and in female fecundity. Female empowerment, female education is the key to bringing population growth under control. That is the single most important element in this process. If you look at the map of the world in terms of life expectancy, there is a glaring problem. So if you look at the map here, in blue we've got dark blue, life expectancy more than 70, paler blue 55 to 70, and go down to red, and less than 40 is red. So Africa is the continent, essentially, that got left out of this transition that I'm talking about in the 20th century. And so as we move forward, we need to understand that we haven't all benefited, and we need to factor that in to our policies as we move forward. And I'm going to suggest that global policy is really going to be critically important. So now let's take a prediction on where the population of the planet is going as we go through this century. This is from the Institute in Vienna, the International Institute that develops statistical analyses on population, and I think it's the best available prediction on population. And you'll see, if you look at the median expectancy in the fractals, that there's a fairly confident prediction that we will have around 9 billion people by mid-century, and that could well be not just a plateau, but a maximum. In other words, the tendency of women to have less than 2 children per woman is going to go global, and we get a slight decrease. In these various fractals, we take into account potential disasters, and we take into account massive improvement in well-being as well. So that's what gives the full range. But let's say the challenge is a population of 9 billion. That's the given, and what does that mean for us as we move forward in this century? Well, I'm going to suggest a carousel of challenges in particular. And in my carousel, you can see we've got food production, climate change, biodiversity, health and education, energy security and supply, water resource, and conflict and terrorism. And I'm going to suggest to you that any attempt to adopt a linear approach to this carousel of challenges is going to fail. And I'll tell you, I'll give you one example for that. Take the challenge from water resource. State of Victoria that is currently, I'm afraid, burning. Temperatures of 47 degrees, the state is rather like a tinderbox. However those fires were started, they're spreading because of the remarkably high temperature they're experiencing this summer, the highest there on record. And the state has actually had 8 years of successive droughts. Farmers are packing their bags, so they can no longer farm in the state. Literally, that is true. And the state government is now providing fresh water from desalination plants. They're building desalination plants on a massive scale, and by the end of this year, roughly one third of the fresh water supply to the towns, villages and cities of the state of Victoria will be from desalination plants. Now you could say, there's technology coming to the rescue, we can desalinate seawater and provide the fresh water needed. Desalination, as many of you know, I'm sure, is a very energy-intensive process, and Australia has an awful lot of coal, and so it's very tempting to use coal to fire the desalination processes, which is what they're doing. Now, I've taken you to the water resource. We've now moved across to energy security and supply, and then we move right across to climate change, because of course as you burn coal, you produce greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide, and you force the temperature of our planet upwards. Oh, and that is of course what causes the desertification in the first place. So what we have is of course an awful feedback term which is making the problem worse. We need to be considerably more thoughtful about how we tackle these problems, and we need to bring them all into bear on our thinking. I'm afraid a holistic approach to these challenges is going to be very necessary. And of course the question is going to be whether we have the global capacity to deliver that sort of positioning. If we move around the curve, look at food production, because of the population growth, but also because of the increased well-being expectancy of people in the planet, the improved well-being of people in China, India, Mexico, etc. is well known, we're going to see a requirement for roughly 50% more crop production, food crop production by 2030. And that's plus or minus quite a small number. We need half as much food again produced by crops. Partly this is because of a propensity for people as they move up the well-being affluence chain to eat more meat. But as we move up that chain, we're going to have considerably more food crops to provide the demand of that increasing population. Now, we've just seen there's a water resource problem. If you look at the population growth, and as we grow, we contaminate more water, freshwater demand is increasing, and those two curves, freshwater availability and demand, cross over, by anybody's calculation, about 2040, 2050 globally. State of Victoria is hitting that early, but globally we see that factor coming in. So what we need for food production is quite simply globally more crop per drop. As we move forward, we have to bring technology to bear to create drought-resistant crops that we will manage to do with the best technology available. Moving across from food production to biodiversity, you see that we get into the issue of land use. So as we use more and more of our available land for crop production, there's a potential for us to remove the remaining forests. And by the way, the forests are also used as an energy supply, particularly in countries like Africa. And so we diminish the amount of land available for the biodiverse systems. So we have a big impact in terms of the loss of our biodiversity. Health and education. If I give you one simple example, we take the H5N1 virus, which is an avian virus, in the sense that it's only birds that pass it on to each other. We don't, even if we contract it. The H5N1 virus has taken from 1995 to the present time to get from Asia into Northern Europe, and it still hasn't got into the United States, and it's followed largely the migratory patterns of wild birds. And you can model it on the basis of these migratory patterns, and eventually it will get into the Americas, but it hasn't got there yet. And in our modelling of this when I was in government, turning it into an H5N1 virus that has become a human virus, which is a probability, and we can discuss what that probability is, I think it's low, but if it did become such a virus and insert it anywhere in the world in the models, within 3 months it would be in every country in the world. Right, so, and why is that? It's because we have a large global population, but also not only population density, but the globalized economy with us all traveling everywhere by aeroplane. So the vector for wild birds is migratory patterns, the vector for humans is the movement of aeroplanes. 3 months after the injection of H5N1 as a human virus, therefore, unless we contained it at the point of injection, we have a global pandemic. And for this country, for Britain, the calculation yields a possible fatality within the next 3 months, short period of time, level of around 300,000 people plus. Now, of course, 300,000 people dying in a short period of time is going to lead to virtual paralysis of our system. People staying at home. Which supermarket cashier is going to come into work with hundreds of people going past him or her every day with the potential for catching the virus? So, and how many parents will still send their children to school even if the government of the day encourages them to go? So we have a potential paralysis not only of Britain, of course, but worldwide. And how well are we prepared in our just-in-time delivery day for a crisis of that magnitude? So as you go around this, you can see that we have a series of problems. Climate change I'm going to dwell on a little bit more, but let me take you across to conflict and terrorism. If you're a very powerful country, you may tend to say, well, we're faced with all these issues, therefore, as an elected government, I need to protect my own people above all others. And therefore, if we're going to, for example, run out of minerals, there's estimated to be about 65 years of copper below the crust of the earth left for us to mine up, then shouldn't we send troops in to facilitate creating friendly governments wherever there might be copper? There's a very large Chinese presence in Zambia now, and I have little doubt that this is to do with that. Not troops, This is people building drainage systems, all very good, creating influence. British miners were in there long before the Chinese got there, for the same reason. I'm going to suggest that as we move through the century, unless we get to grips with this problem globally, we potentially are going to lead ourselves into a situation where large, powerful nations will secure the resources for their own people at the expense of others, and this can only lead to more conflict. And as we move through the century with rising sea levels and with increased crop production, land mass available to the growing population gets smaller per person. So land itself becomes a challenge. So we have two paths in front of us. One is a path where the powerful step forward and do what they can. And on that pathway, I'm going to suggest that future historians might look back on our particular recent past and see the Iraq War as the first of the conflicts of this kind, the first of the resource wars. The United States, having developed itself as a very oil-dependent economy based on its own oil production, and then reaching peak oil in the United States, and then worrying about energy security and supply, and casting its eye around the world, and there was Iraq. Now, the estimate of the cost to America of the Iraq War is about $3 trillion. I'm quoting Stiglitz, the Nobel Prize winner's estimate. I went into the White House in 2001 to try and persuade them that decarbonizing their economy was the way forward. I didn't get much shrift at that time. But what I can tell you is that if I had managed to persuade the government of America that investing instead of going into Iraq, investing in decarbonizing their economy with roughly a tenth of that money, they would have managed it. So there are alternatives available to us, and the question is whether we understand what science and technology can deliver and get that understanding into the governance procedures of our governments. I happen to feel very strongly that there are these alternative paths in front of us where we do manage and govern through what science can deliver, or we go down the route of conflict, which is a more traditional route for managing these processes. Now, let's just run through some of these challenges with a little more detail. Freshwater stress. If you look at the figure for 1995, and I'm only going to 2025 on the right-hand side, you'll see that if you look at water withdrawal as a percentage of the total available, the worst hit areas are more than 40% has already been withdrawn, and the green areas less than 10%. So the most stressed areas are the brown, and the yellow are moving towards being the most stressed areas. And what we see, for example, in Africa is desertification tending to move from north towards the equator and from south towards the equator. And you'll see that even on this map, the concern I've expressed about South Australia and Victoria doesn't even show up at this level. So we have freshwater stress. If we go to mid-century, the problem is considerably worse. Now let's take a look at something that is, for me, the problem that there is quite insufficient attention being paid to, and that is the state of our oceans. Just take this as a measure of the state of our oceans. This is the percentage decline in catch. Not because we're sending less fishermen out there to catch fish. The percentage decline in catch is because the fish stock is falling. And you'll see that the whole planet is covered in red and pink on this curve, and you'll see that the best is less than 1%, the very pale, and then you've got a 50 to 80% reduction where we have the darkest colour. We have a massive problem in terms of feedstock for human beings from the seas, but there's another hidden problem here, or series of problems. We tend to regard the Amazon forests as the lungs of the planet. That's an overstatement. The lungs of the planet are the oceans. 50% of our oxygen comes from the plankton of the oceans. We are acidifying the oceans by putting carbon dioxide, increasing carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere, already a lowering of pH by 0.1. And as we move forward through this century, business as usual, that acidification is going to increase radically. We are warming the oceans. The combination of these various effects is extremely substantial in terms of the living species in the oceans. And of course, if you look at the whole food pattern, not just for ourselves, but for all mammals, for all, for example, birds off the British coast, depend heavily on what is available in terms of food from the ocean. So we have a very big problem in terms of what we're doing to the oceans. And when people say we can manage climate change by putting mirrors up, a slightly absurd notion, but let's suppose it would work, putting mirrors up into the stratosphere to reflect the sunlight back, what about what we're doing to the ocean? We really have to manage carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere and in the oceans as well. Here's an important element of the problem. Earlier last year, you'll see between March and May, we had a very substantial rise in food prices. We have around 1 billion people on the planet out of the total 6.8 billion today who are at that level of of malnutrition, close to starvation, where lifespan is very short indeed. And when prices get hiked up like this, that number of 1 billion suddenly also gets hiked up very substantially. So the biggest impact of a price increase in staple foods hits, of course, the least well off on the planet. What caused that big rise? Well, the initial push on the rise was, again, an unintended consequence from what might have seemed to be a good policy in the United States, which was to create biofuels from maize products, from the carbohydrate product of the maize, and in so doing, to remove the maize from the grain itself from the food chain. So we were producing fuel instead of food. The estimate is that 70% of the initial rise, and I'd say 50 to 70%, big error bars on this number, comes from that factor. Another factor was a massive additional loss of rice due to flooding. So that was an extreme flooding event. But I'm also going to suggest that with good science and technology, we could have avoided completely the loss of the rice crop last year. Right? So because, and I'm going to explain, science and technology already knows how to deal with flooded rice plains. But let me just deal with this issue of water footprints. I said more crop per drop, and we're going to manage it through science and technology, and I have little doubt we can do it. But here's another important figure I mentioned. As we move our societies into eating more and more meat, you'll see if you look at water footprints, and that's maize at the top and beef at the bottom, there's an enormous difference in the amount of water, fresh water needed to produce the high meat consumption of the more advanced societies. And by the way, carbon dioxide matches this curve very closely as well. So what we have is a problematic situation from our own behavioral trends as we become more affluent. Now let me just push this point about flooding and rice. Marketable rice will survive flooding for 2 or 3 days. Anything in excess of that and the rice plant dies. And what you see in this figure, this is in the Philippines, the International Rice Research Institute. On the left is normal marketable rice planted in the same paddy as rice which has been modified based on the discovery of one wild rice variety in India. It was given the name FR13A, flood-resistant 13A, which survives 3 to 4 weeks in totally flooded conditions, as shown here, and the plant grows and produces the rice product. Now, this wild rice is not marketable. It doesn't taste at all good. But you can use genetic markers, find out which genes provide the protein that give the flood resistance, snip that into marketable rice, and you get the product on the right. That product has yet to be marketed, although this discovery was made in 1995, basically because of the European attitude towards GM technology, which has now pervaded the developing world. In sub-Saharan Africa, South Africa is the only country where GM plant crops can be grown. Now imagine if this plant on the right had been grown throughout Asia in that period when they had that flood last year. The crops would have survived. Now in this International Rice Research Institute in the Philippines, there are scientists working up to their knees, I'm going to be polite, and up to their elbows in mud and paddies, planting and following standard plant breeding techniques to develop the same product. And in 2010, they're expecting it to reach the market, 15 years after the discovery. GM technology produces the same product, pretty well the same product, in a year. And then, of course, you have to test it in the marketplace. So here we have a situation where I would say thousands, hundreds of thousands, possibly millions of people are suffering because we are turning away the best of what science can offer. This is a problem for all of us because it involves our engagement with the public community. That awful word Frankenfoods dealt us a terrible blow. And the Daily Mail campaign that ran with it. Now, I've left myself very little time with the biggest topic still to deal with. Easily the biggest challenge, I believe, facing us is what we're doing to the atmosphere. The oceans as well, but let me focus on the atmosphere. We have learnt through the latter part of the 20th century how to handle what all of our technology, signified at the bottom of this curve, has been doing to the atmosphere. Remember these, some of us, I'm old enough to remember the smogs of London, dealt with in a single measure by government, not regulating but banning coal fires from our cities. The last smog was eliminated in 1963. So we learnt that carbon particles were causing smogs. We call them now nanoparticles, but they're still the same particles. Carbon particles were causing smogs. They came from coal fires which produced incomplete combustion. If it was complete combustion, we'd go to carbon dioxide and we would say that's fine, colourless, tasteless, odourless. And that's the problem with this figure. We can't signify what carbon dioxide is doing to the planet because it's not visible to us. But all of the other problems, the NOx gases from the back end of cars, I go into any city in the world and I can instantly tell whether they have car exhaust regulation in that country or not. If you've got car exhaust regulation, you've cleaned up your atmosphere. The amazing response of the scientific community to the challenge set down by progressive regulation to get rid of every fume from the back end of a car. If you take Euro 6 standards on a car and you put a diesel-engined car, any diesel-engined car in this room, and ran it, it would clean up the room. Right? So we've moved the standard on massively to clean up our cities. We can do that. We need to understand the science and we need to persuade governments to pick it up and regulate. Every car manufacturer in the world complains with every new standard as the standard is tightened up. We couldn't possibly do it, and then they get on and do it. And by the way, then the consumer pays for it. The single most important and most expensive addition to the modern car is the car exhaust catalyst system. So we know how to handle these problems, all the way up to the stratosphere with ozone creating, a hole being created in the ozone layer through CFCs, the banning of CFCs in Montreal, massively successful. That hole is still there, but our calculations indicate that by mid-century it will actually have repaired itself. So we know how to deal with these problems, and then we come to the biggest problem of all. And of course that is the complete combustion of carbon produces carbon dioxide, and if we remove forests, we're removing one of the pumps of carbon dioxide, one of the natural ways of removing carbon dioxide. So what has actually happened since the time of Darwin is that we have seen a massive transformation. I'm going to, have I got a pointer? Perhaps. I'm just going to take the top curve. It's a stunning bit of science. And what we see is temperature on the horizontal axis going upwards. This is from oxygen 18 to oxygen 16 ratio. And millions of years along the horizontal axis. And you see that, the vertical axis is temperature. So 0 is today, and on this side 60 million years ago. So as you go from left to right, you're moving towards the present day from 60 million years ago, and there's a peak in the global temperature, the peak being perhaps 10, 12 degrees centigrade higher than now. This is the Eocene-Pliocene transition. And it took 50 million years for the temperature to cool down to the sort of temperature that we consider roughly normal. And, ups and downs, and then we hit the instability in the global temperature system. The instability creeps in about 2.5 million years ago. That's not noise in the data. That's the instability where the temperature is either cold or warm. It seldom stays in between, and that instability we refer to as the ice ages and the warm periods. So that instability sets in about 2.5 million years ago, and we get to the present day. And the present day, I'm going to now refer to the lower figure, we have a warm period. And the warm period so far has been about 12,000 years long. Let me just walk over and point it out. So we emerged from the last ice age, 18,000 years ago, up to the present warm period, and there we've been for 12,000 years. I want to point this out because it's no coincidence. This is the period of our civilization. Right? 12,000 years, we happen to be in a warm period. Now go back in time and you see these are the oscillations. Warm periods were very short. This is the longest warm period we've had in that time. Why? Possibly because of anthropogenic behavior. Possibly because our predecessors were taking forests out when they started farming land. And as we move forward then, we can take a look at carbon dioxide levels in red. So temperature blue, carbon dioxide in red, and you see that there is, every time we have a warm period, carbon dioxide levels are about 270 parts per million. Every time we have an ice age, about 200 parts per million. And then we come to the post-Darwinian period, and industrialization spreads around the world, beginning somewhere up in Manchester, and we fuel that process by burning fossil fuels. Now, fossil fuels are naturally sequestered carbon. And the reason why carbon dioxide has stayed between these limited levels is partly, and Darwin would love this, is partly due to co-evolution of species that either consume or provide carbon dioxide, plants and animals, and also the development of rock formation, such as dolomites from carbonates. So we've got this co-evolution, but coupled into that co-evolution is carbon dioxide within 200 to 270 parts per million. And keeping our temperatures very stable, and our life forms are stable too. So humanity appears in this last phase within the last million years. And so we need to just bear in mind what is happening. There's the rise in carbon dioxide since industrialization. That red line isn't a mistake on the graph. That's us burning fossil fuels and removing forests as quickly as we can. The carbon dioxide level is now 380, this year is now moving towards 389. It's increasing at 2 parts per million a year. And as I said, normal warm period would be around 270. And what you've also got to bear in mind is, when we go into a warm period, we lose a lot of ice that was sitting on land, and it goes into the ocean, and the ocean's warming up, so the ocean rises. So as we go from an ice age to a warm period, change in ocean level about 100 meters. The map of the world changes. Russia was connected to America in the last ice age. That may have been a good thing. And then we move to the present period. Well, of course, then you've got to ask, as we warm up, how much more ice have we got to lose? If all the Greenland ice sheet is lost, we would have and due to that alone, the global sea level would rise by about 6.5 meters. And of course, London would be very, very, well, I would say impossible to save at that point. So how far back do you have to go in time to reach the level of carbon dioxide and greenhouse gases that we've already got to? And the answer is roughly 3 million years, where we've got the pink curve. Now, there's an inertia in our climate system which is worth about 30 years, because we're increasing the carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases so rapidly that if we stopped where we are now, it would take another 30 years to catch up with that amount of carbon dioxide. So temperatures, the good news is we've switched off the next ice age. We've got out of those instabilities. The bad news is we're moving into the first hot period for a very long time. How far back could we go? Well, if we tried our utmost and burnt all of the fossil fuels available to us and took out the remaining forests, I believe we could climb right back up to that point 50 million years ago, when there was no ice left on land. Antarctica was a subtropical forest, and there were very large mammals. If you go down the ice cores and you get to the land below, you still find the remnants of that period underneath the ice. So there's the challenge for us. How do we stop ourselves from inducing that transition all the way up the curve? And I'm suggesting it's a very big challenge, and let me just skip now a little bit, because we need, globally, all potential 9 billion of us to agree where we're going. Today in Britain we're emitting 11 tons of carbon dioxide per person per annum on average. In America it's 22 tons, they have the record, per person per annum. In India it's about 1.5, in China it's 4.5. So we have this massive disparity of the amount of carbon dioxide we're putting into the atmosphere. What do I think the stabilization level ought to be? The lowest possible. So if we could aim to stay below 450 parts per million, we've got a much better chance of leaving a better planet for our successors than if we stabilize at a higher level. So let's say it was 450. What do we have to do? Well, we, globally, need to reduce our emissions by 50% from where we are now. That is, today we're at 36 billion tons of carbon dioxide globally. So by mid-century we need to be at half that, 18 billion tons globally. We'll have 9 billion people, simple target, 2 tons per person per annum by mid-century. So what I'm saying is, and I've been saying this around the world, to governments around the world, we need a declaration from each of you that we will aim to reduce our emissions to 2 tons per person per annum by mid-century. And the British government has led the way, with Ed Miliband saying we will reduce our emissions by 80% by 2050. If you work out 20% of 11 is 2.2 tons. That's where it comes from. And as we move on through the century, we have to drop further. India, therefore, can allow itself to increase its emissions. China is already beyond the 2 tons. So we're all in this together. Massive requirement. We need not only to know where we're going globally, we need agreed national targets, we need a fiscal process to tie us all nations into the process. That fiscal process means internalizing the external cost of producing carbon dioxide, And in my view, the European trading scheme is the right model way forward. So we need a cap on each country which moves down with time, and we trade carbon dioxide amongst ourselves. So far, ETS trading is worth about £150 billion. My estimate when it goes global, I say when it goes global, I'm an optimist about Copenhagen, is that it'll be worth around £1 trillion by the time it goes global. So by 2015, there's my estimate of what the carbon dioxide trading will be worth. And then, of course, we need to focus back on those parts of the world that are already under stress and where climate change is going to be a massive additional stress. So the part of the world that will be most stressed by climate change is going to be Africa. We are adapting already in this country, the first nation to be adapting against climate change, to the tune of about £300 million a year. That was a program I set and trained in government, managing flood and coastal defence risks for Britain, additional funding put in as a result of that program of work. These countries can't afford it. So how do we generate a pool of money where we can manage both technology transfer so these countries can leap into the low carbon technologies we will develop and also manage adaptation against climate change? Simple answer, by the way, take that $1 trillion value of the carbon dioxide trade process, create permits for selling, auction permits for selling carbon dioxide, and the auction generates the money that you would need. If you take £1 trillion and take a fraction of that generated by the auction, you've actually paid the cost. So we could manage it, but this, to me, is the minimal requirement from Copenhagen. I can see that I'm running out of time, but I do want to say African development is key. We have been so wrong in many of our policies around Africa. Come back to what I said initially. Science, engineering in particular, technology, agriculture, medicine, nursing, all of these things have produced our well-being, and all of those skills are in short supply in Africa. Anything that we do in Africa ought to be aimed at improving human capital, human skills in that part of the world. And when we move into a food aid model, for example, I'm afraid we create a food dependency. We need to move into a much more sophisticated model of aiding the development of Africa than we've been in the past. Now, I'm just going to suggest to you that there are a number of challenges here for scientists as we move into the 21st century, a whole range of challenges, but one of them is the challenge to decarbonize our economies, not only by increasing energy efficiencies, but by producing a whole string of new energy production technologies where we're using what is available to us. And on this map of the world, I'm simply showing with these 6 little squares how much solar energy we would have to convert to provide all of the energy requirements of 9 billion people by mid-century. We have 10,000 times as much solar energy reaching the planet as we need to convert into usable energy for our various uses. Now, I'm also going to suggest that that old idea that invention is as a result of necessity is absolutely right. We've never had to do this before because we've always had access to fossil fuels and they've appeared to be very cheap. Now we need to just focus our attention massively on this problem, whether it's through life sciences, physical sciences. We just need to be so much smarter. And I'm convinced when I'm challenged, what do you mean? I say, well, for example, all of the photovoltaic materials currently available, virtually all of them, are silicon-based. Why? Because semiconductor physicists understand silicon better than any other material. Why not ceramics? Why not plastics? Why not paints? Why not materials that architects like to use on the outside of buildings, rather than these awful blue silicon plates that cost a fortune because they have to be produced in vacuum? So we just need to get a whole lot smarter about the technologies that we develop. I think I want to end on this note of the challenges. I'm fully aware that the challenges we face are massive. And on the one hand, take national perceptions versus global priorities. I come back to what I was saying. Each nation may decide to grasp these problems for the benefit of its own people, or we may all understand that the best way to do it is to strengthen the global negotiating processes. I'm not sure that the United Nations processes set in train in 1946 are fit for purpose to the challenges I'm now discussing. So we need to re-examine our big international agreement processes. We need also, of course, to look at this question of consumerism. Consumerism has been a wonderful model, I would suggest, for growing our economies in the 20th century. Is that model still fit for purpose in the 21st century when resource shortage is our biggest challenge? Now, there's a human behavior challenge for the behavioral scientist of an enormous order of magnitude. Certainly, I think that rampant consumerism of the kind that we often see, and I did get into trouble when, if I may, a young woman at the end of one of my talks said to me, "What should I do about climate change?" And I said, "Stop admiring young men in Ferraris." and the point about it, of course, that I was making is that's a cultural transition. We need to move away from that particular model. Nostalgic romanticism. Let's not, as has been suggested in high places in this country, put forward the idea that we move backwards in time to a kind of pre-science, pre-technology golden era. But finally, the challenges to science and technology. We, in my view, do understand better how to land a craft on Mars. We do understand more about the Higgs boson than we know about developing methods of dealing with malaria, methods of dealing with HIV/AIDS, and most importantly of all, methods of delivering energy that doesn't create global warming. Thank you.
Sir David, thank you. We've been privileged to an exhibition of the scientific mind at full stretch, scientific intelligence ranging over millions of years, ranging over all the important problems that face humanity. It's been a pessimistic outlook and yet at the same time an optimistic one. There is a sort of cheerfulness in the picture we've been getting that science actually does have answers. Science actually does know what to do about not all our problems, but a lot of them. And the trick is going to be, of course, to persuade people to act on the wisdom of science. I've been impressed, as Sir David mentioned, we know how to land a rocket on Mars, we know more about the Higgs boson, etc. I've been impressed when I visited CERN in Geneva by what human cooperation can do when it's properly organized. I was literally moved to tears by being shown around CERN and seeing what can be done when science cooperates around the world. So politics is the problem, humans are the problem, a very big problem, we're all part of it. I was consoled by the feeling what politician, what human indeed could fail to be impressed, fail to be moved by the calm, intelligent, informed, inspired wisdom of Sir David King. Thank you very much.